Okay, so I'm going to get going. Welcome everybody to today's webinar. It's the third out of the 4 in the series that we have called Beyond the Lab. And today we're going to be talking about managing your mental well-being through your career and your professional development. So for those of you who aren't really aware, who are ELRIG? We are a company whose purpose is to bring together the life science and drug discovery communities, bring them together to learn, share, connect, innovate, collaborate, all on an open access basis. And the way that we achieve this is through providing world-class conferences, networking events, webinars such as this one, and increasing our digital content. And our values are to always ensure the highest quality of content and that content will be available to everybody. We're an inclusive organisation because we serve a diverse scientific network. For your awareness, we are a volunteer-led organisation run for and by the life sciences community, all on a not-for-profit basis. So who are our community? Who do we serve? So we have a community of over 22,000 scientists from across industry. So that could be pharma and biotech, but also academia and our life science suppliers. So people who provide products and services, our vendors essentially, who exhibit and support all of our events, making all of our events free to attend, a little bit like SRG, who are our partners for this webinar series. So 70% of our community work in the life science industry and 20% in academia. Obviously, there are other roles out there that fill up that remainder as well. But a third of our community identify themselves as ECPs. So we define that as an early career professional who are within 5 years of finishing their latest degree. 50% of our community study drug discovery, and geographically about 75% of the community are based in the UK, 13% in Europe and 3% in the USA, although that is always changing for us at the moment. 50% of our community is female, 35% are non-white, and 3% have disclosed a disability. And our community is a dynamic mix of researchers who are involved in lots of different aspects of the drug discovery process, and we're all trying to better equip the drug discovery process. So a little bit about the session today and what we're going to talk about. There's lots of evidence to say that being proactive in your career planning and your professional development helps to maintain or manage your mental well-being and allow you to cope with uncertainty and change. And during today's session, we're going to hear from our panel and learn from some of their personal reflections. We're really going to scratch the surface today on topics such as good practice when job searching and recruitment, and coping with career change and career precarity, loneliness, feelings of isolation, all with a strong emphasis on psychological safety. So how today is going to run is we've got a little bit of content for you, and then we're going to pose some questions to our panel, and they're going to answer some of the questions about the topics that I've just talked about there. We do have a Q&A box available for you in the session. Make sure you engage with that, ask your questions if you have them. Try not to use the chat function because some of the questions get lost in there, but we do have the Q&A function. I'll collate some of those questions and pose them to our panel, but also members of the panel can message back an answer in the Q&A chat box as well. So organising the session today are myself, Cassie Messenger. So a bit of a background about me is that I currently work as an assay scientist at GSK, but I'm also an ELRIG board member. And I'm an advocate for mental wellbeing. As like many others, I've had my own journey trying to figure out how to manage my mental well-being. And partly that came from trying to mix academia and industry and studying for a PhD part-time alongside my day job. And so now I try and use that experience to advocate for mental well-being across all sectors. And also who has been organising the session is Claire Viney, who is Chief Executive at CRAC Vitae, a not-for-profit charity supporting the career and professional development of researchers working with numerous governments and institutions across multiple countries. And I'm actually going to hand over to Claire to talk through some stats and a little bit about mental wellbeing in research careers.
Thanks, Cassie. So just a few of the really shocking headlines that happened over the last few years around health and well-being of researchers. And I'm just going to give some statistics and some of the research and evidence that we collect. As Cassie said, we work closely with governments, not just here in the UK, but beyond the UK, and universities, and working directly with researchers as well. A lot of this extrapolates into beyond academia, and some of the challenges are very similar in beyond academia to those in academia. Back in 2017, there was a review by RAND, who are a research company that was commissioned by the Royal Society and the Wellcome Trust, and they found that a large proportion of postgraduates in particular reported symptoms of depression, emotion, or stress-related problems. The high stress levels were comparable to high-risk groups such as healthcare workers. So this is when funders and governments started to take notice. The charity that I lead has been working with researchers since 1968, and we've constantly advocated for career and professional development support. Health and well-being and mental well-being is a big part of that. In 2017, there was a seminal study by Katia Levesque that looked at the Flanders case, and 32% of doctoral researchers were at risk of having or developing common psychiatric disorder. So that's when the European Commission started to take notice as well. In 2018, working with and funded by what's now called Research England, but it was HEFCE at the time. So this is the UK major funder. We worked with the University of Ghent to learn from some of the research that Katia had done, and the Institute of Employment Studies. And basically, we found that the statistics were really similar to those found in Flanders, and that there were risk factors such as internationally mobile researchers, those who were part-time, so drawing interesting your personal experience, Cassie, those with disabilities, those with family or caring responsibilities, they had an increased risk in relation to their health and well-being. And basically the supervisory relationship, so the support network around you during your PhD researcher experience, was critical. And so a lot of advice, support, guidance has been given to not just researchers themselves, but supervisors, to ensure that we have a culture and research of that. So if you can just move on to the next slide, Cassie, and I've just summarised that. So if you go on to the next one. So what the research that we did, those sort of imposter syndrome, perfectionism, I talked a little bit, I've already mentioned the supervisory challenges and issues, self-finance, so people that were funding their own studies, visas, so for those of you who might be from outside of the UK, and the challenges around visas, isolation. So I think during the pandemic, we see this exacerbated, but there was a lot of research done just before the pandemic that we were able to then track and monitor going through the pandemic. And then workload expectations, professional identity and role. So as you become an independent researcher, there are things you don't necessarily know what's expected of you. You're having to navigate through a very complex landscape, sometimes with little or no support. And obviously your personal circumstances can increase those risk factors. So as I said, care and responsibilities, those who are disabled, those from minoritized groups. Next slide, please, Cassie. So doctoral degree in particular was seen as a particularly stressful situation. You're not a student, so there are a huge amount of support for undergraduate students here in the UK and globally. As a researcher, as a postgraduate researcher, it was felt that you weren't staff, but you weren't a student. You sort of sat in no man's land. And really that supervisory relationship was really important. And the precarity. So we know that higher education, around 80% of early career researchers and early career professionals are on fixed term contracts. Now, many sectors have fixed term contracts. It's ways of employers bringing talent in when at the point that they need it, but higher education is overly reliant, and there's been a lot of work done by governments and funders to look at why that is, and institutions themselves, but that sense of precarity can have big consequences to those individuals, and not knowing where to go and the signposting. So there were lots of actions and outcomes that came from the piece of research, and some policy recommendations where funders and government and institutions were able to put in place things like mandating 10 days of career and professional development support, for example, and looking at things like cohort training, where you're bringing people together, actually lab-based disciplines. There are some differences. If you're in arts and humanities, the sense of isolation, and social sciences, sense of isolation is even more increased than perhaps it might be if you're a chemist like myself, because of that lab-based environment and the camaraderie. If you go on to the next slide, Cassie. During the pandemic, things got obviously a little bit worse, and we were able to make the case to government for increased investment and resourcing and support. We also helped to make the case for the extension for a lot of funding for postgraduate researchers, because obviously the precarious, they were worried about not just their research, but worried about funding. And we were able to then obviously put in place institutional support and funder support for those researchers. So the low levels of mental well-being, as we all, the uncertainty around the pandemic did definitely play out through researchers' lives. And as I say, we were able to put in place some mechanisms as a community, as a research community. If you go on to the next slide, Cassie. So some of those things are the welcome research that on research culture. What culture do we need? UKRI implemented things like they're tackling bullying and harassment, so whistleblowing policies. The wheel that's sort of in the middle at the bottom there is our researcher development framework. So that was around empowering researchers and empowering all of us to take control and charge of our career and professional development. And then there was an £8 million investment by government into specific actions and supports around mental health and wellbeing. And all of this information is freely open and accessibly available. So, a lot of institutions will signpost you if you're at an academic institution, and a lot of that's there. And I know that there's some links at the end of the webinar of useful signposting. So check some of those out. Next slide, Cassie. Pressure and stress are so intertwined, and obviously, we need to put ourselves out of our comfort zone to learn, but we don't want to be stressed out. And I like this diagram because it's helped me to think sometimes about where I am on this sort of on this archway, thinking about whether I'm in that feel-good zone or whether I'm in the stressed out zone. Next slide, Cassie. So what can we do? Well, what we absolutely know is that engaging in your professional and career development opportunities helps you to feel in control. It helps you to consider your motivations. It can help you to address work-life balance by getting involved. You can build your support networks. It can help you understand what to, commit to. Learning to say no is sometimes equally as good as finding out of all the different opportunities that are around you. You can research what can help. And you can ask for help. And actually, for lots of us, offering help and being involved in supporting others can be really important for our own health and well-being. Next slide, Cassie. So there are some stats. So this is from PRES. This is the Postgraduate Research Experience Survey, which is run by Advanced HE. But the latest data, I couldn't find the answers to this specific question. But basically, what this lovely bar chart shows is that those who take part in development opportunities are much more likely to have a positive personal outlook. So, it's really important, and there is evidence that suggests that, by taking part in things like today's webinar, seeking out opportunities, whether you're in industry or whether you're beyond, whether you're in academia, that, those will have a positive personal outlook and outcomes. Next slide, Cassie. And this is a specific survey that we do called CEDARS, which is the Culture, Employment and Development in Academic Research survey, which happens every other year. And we run this survey with around 70 universities, and it gives us an indication of the levels of essentially satisfaction, but also helps us to understand the shifts and changes in behaviours. So roughly 70% of research staff in the UK, there's about 43,000 postdocs in academia currently today, and around 70% of them aspire to a career in academia. with 63% roughly expecting to achieve this. Although in some disciplines it can be less than 10% who will actually have a meaningful and long-term academic career. And so there is a mismatch of expectations, and so therefore by taking control of your career and professional development and helping to understand all of those different career options and aspirations can help with your health and well-being. If you look at the sort of statistics on the slide, lots of research staff, so 47% would like help and support training within their health and well-being. And OAS is other academic staff, so it's 36% of also would like support. So there's a real call from early career researchers and mid-career researchers for better support from their institutions, and that certainly is being picked up by not just the institutions themselves, but by funders and governments. And those of you who are in industry, performance development reviews, professional conversations are part of the DNA. They're part of your daily, the support that you get from your employer. That's not always the case in an academic environment. And so therefore we're trying to drive better employment practices within academia to help counteract some of these challenges. Only 37% of postdocs, so research staff, have regular career development reviews with their managers. And yet almost 80% would find this really useful. So there's still a little bit of work for us, those of us in the career and professional development sector, to do. And so therefore, we encourage and try and support people to have those conversations with their supervisors, their employers, and so take control of their own career and professional development. If you go on to the next slide, I'm done. But I'm really happy. Hopefully that's given you a flavour of some of the statistics and some of the challenges. And I know that my esteemed colleagues will be picking up some of those themes in their reflections as well.
Thank you, Claire. So hopefully that gives everyone a little bit of a flavour about why it's important, and most of us here are scientists. We quite like data, we quite like statistics. So put some numbers behind why this is so important. So I'm now going to introduce the rest of our panel today before we head into the questions. So as well as myself and Claire, we've also got Vicky Wright, aka the PhD Life Coach, who is an ex-professor, coach and podcast host. And as the PhD Life Coach, she helps clients deal with overwhelm, procrastination and imposter syndrome. We also have Peter Simpson, drug discovery consultant and the chair of EFIRA and Dia Beta Labs. Peter is a champion for the employer's responsibility in managing mental well-being in order to develop high-performing teams. We have Fiona Brown, who has 20 years of big pharma experience at GSK and was heavily involved in coaching during that time, and has more recently had a bit of a career change and is now an accredited psychodynamic and person-centered counsellor. And finally, we have Faye Allison from recruitment agency SRG, who are our partners for this webinar series. And Faye has an interest and a passion for mental well-being, and will be able to provide an insight on good practice for job searching and managing your mental well-being through that transition. So to dive in to some of the questions, we'll get going. Thank you, first of all, for everyone who's given their time today. But first, I'm going to go back to Claire and say, it probably seems obvious now after the slides and after your introduction, but why do you think that it's so important to be invested in your mental well-being throughout your career and your professional development?
I think it's essential. My career, I've spent 24 years now working in charities and career and professional development. And if you don't know where you're going, how do you know when you get there? And by taking control and getting support around you, then you're able to, feel, well, just that, that mental load is shared in a way, isn't it? So I think, there's lots of advice and guidance and support out there. It's just knowing where it is, and that signposting. So I think I definitely know that I've been supported by lots of my managers and also my peers over my career. So again, asking for support and help is really, really important, especially at transitions. So I think when you transition from academia to beyond academia, when I went on maternity leave, when I've had promotions, any transition in your life, often you need support. And you need to talk to people and seek out that guidance and support.
Thank you, Claire. Happy for anybody else on the panel to jump in at that point as well, if you have anything burning you'd like to share. Okay, so next I'm going to come on to Vicky. So you interact with lots of PhD students and postdocs in your workshops and courses, and ironically, because actually these people aren't alone in their feeling, loneliness and isolation are topics that tend to come up a lot in mental wellbeing conversations in academia. How do you help people deal with this? And as a follow-up question, are there any other topics that come up time and time again?
Yeah, absolutely. So I work with people from really early PhDs all the way through to pretty senior researchers. And I think the things that I encourage them to think about with loneliness and isolation is, firstly, think about what you're making it mean that you're lonely and isolated, because feeling lonely doesn't feel good anyway. But when we make it mean a bunch of stuff about ourselves, it gets way more painful. So if we make it mean that we don't belong, or we make it mean that people don't like us, or that it's a toxic workplace and all of these things, then it gets loads more painful. This isn't the moment to beat yourself up. You're getting some information from your emotions. They're telling you that you're feeling lonely, and we can then use that information to decide what we're going to do. And this is particularly important if you have characteristics that mean maybe you have different life experiences from the people you're working with. This is really not the time to make that mean that there's something wrong with you, but rather that this is telling you something that you can work with. The second thing is that when we tell ourselves, I'm lonely and isolated, and that's a problem, we usually feel a bunch of negative emotions. We feel things like sadness. Maybe we feel disappointed if we didn't think it was going to be like that, or we feel ashamed because maybe we think it should be different. And the problem is, those emotions, while completely valid, make it really hard to change stuff, because if you're feeling sad and disappointed and ashamed, you're probably not going to reach out and make connections. So what I'd really encourage you to do is think about it, not like putting toxic positivity on or anything, but thinking, rather than thinking I'm lonely and isolated, thinking I would like to have more connection at work. Because then we start to feel things like hope or curiosity or openness and things like that. And then when we're feeling those emotions, it's way easier to go to that seminar at work and actually talk to people. I see people at all levels who say that they're lonely and say that they're isolated, and because of those emotions, then don't go to things where they could be connecting with people. And then the third thing is, don't aim for a whole community at once. So often, same with like healthcare. I'm a sports scientist by training, and people say, I want to be fit and healthy. It's like, no, don't think about being fit and healthy. Just go for a walk today. How about that? Just do that bit. I have a whole podcast episode about this in my podcast, The PhD Life Coach, about how you can just aim to create one tiny bridge today. So if you want more community, who could you talk to? I joke about picking off the week, but like if you go to a seminar or you go to some sort of networking event, you don't have to talk to the people that are right in the middle, being all extrovert and knowing everyone. You can talk to the ones around the edges that are hanging around with the food and things like that. Think about ways that you can make tiny steps towards building the community that you wish you had. In terms of what comes up regularly, I think the biggest thing is I'm what's called compassion first coaching. So coming from the point of view that beating ourselves up really doesn't get ourselves anywhere when we want to change things. And lots of people, especially high achieving people like all of you guys, think that if they start to be compassionate with themselves, then they just won't get anything done. And so what I spend a lot of time with in my one-to-one practice, but also with my groups, is helping people figure out the difference between being compassionate to yourself and being indulgent. Because people think they're going to just be indulgent. They're just, oh, if I don't beat myself up, I won't get anything done. But in reality, being compassionate is being nice to your present self and to your future self. So you're ever unsure whether you're being compassionate or indulgent. Is this good just for me today, but it's bad for me in the future? In which case it's probably indulgent. Or is this good for me now and good for future me? If you think about your best teacher ever, they were rarely the one that let you do whatever you wanted. They were usually the one that was lovely to you and had high expectations and push you to achieve what you can. And we can generate that sort of approach for ourselves as well with support.
Thank you, Vicky. Some of that realization when you realize that it's not just academia that this is applicable to, it's actually everyone. I can see Absolutely. Reasons that that is important in my everyday work life as well. Okay, thank you for that. Next, I'm going to move on to Peter. So why do you think an employer's responsibility in mental well-being and psychological safety is so important as a first question?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things in there, isn't there? What is your responsibility as an employer, but also what is your wish as an employer? So you have I think, an ethical responsibility to look after your staff, but you also have a desire that they're going to be able to perform well, they're going to want to stay, they're going to be successful in the environment. And I think there is the opportunity to, as an employer, make that easier. So I often look back at one example of a time in my career, the first time I was made redundant. I use the word the first time because it is the nature of this career that you're going to get made redundant. And I'm sure you have some of your GSK. It's one of the things that happens in the industry, and it sucks. And it's a bit like, the first time a girl breaks up with you, it's devastating. By the third or fourth time, you kind of get in the hang of it. That's kind of how I feel now. But then I was working for Merck, and I had then to relocate to AstraZeneca, which was a couple of 100 miles away. My wife had to resign her job, move with me. She was 5 months pregnant at the time, and we had a 1-year-old child. And so we were house hunting and doing preparation for childbirth. And we're living in temporary accommodation with none of our stuff. And I was trying to work in a brand new job and a brand new therapeutic area with brand new people, and I didn't understand what was going on. And on the second day, they made me biology lead on a kinase oncology project. I had never worked in kinases, and I had never worked in oncology. And after a few months, it was evident to me that I was not making a brilliant job of being a dad or a husband or at work. And there's a sense of, well, of course not. Because the employer made it almost impossible to be killing it. And their expectation was that I would just be killing it because I've turned up and you've got a good track record, so crack on with it. I like to think support mechanisms might be better now. But sometimes you have to go, well, I'm not making a great job of it, but I'm turning up as a husband and as a father and at work, and I'm doing my best. And at some point, I'm going to be killing it. But it's not today. And that expectation that if you don't provide support, your employees are going to be doing brilliant and loving their job, it doesn't reflect reality, and it doesn't make them feel good about the situation that you've put them in. So why not be helpful to them? It's a better situation, and it's more likely they'll stay and thrive there.
Absolutely. As a follow-up question, potentially topically, you are our only male panelist today. And the conversation around men's mental health is increasing, and we are getting more and more awareness. But in your opinion, is there anything that workplaces can be doing to provide more support in helping men discuss their mental health?
Yeah, it is something that you have to work on as a man, and I have gotten slightly better at, but I'm still rubbish at it, I think. But as a man, there is that sense of if people ask you how you do, and the answer is fine. And that was certainly how I responded when I joined AstraZeneca. I'm doing fine, full stop. I didn't invite people in to help or support. And so there are clearly practical things that a workplace can do, things like mental health first aid or training, and the creation of safe spaces, and the, frankly, elimination of toxic line managers. All of those things are things that workplaces can do that will make it easier for men to feel that they can go to a first aid or go to a safe space or not be oppressed by their current line manager. I think for me, when I think about workplaces, I think a lot of us have to recognize that we are the workplace. So maybe there can be an HR policy and the board can pass a resolution, but none of that makes a difference. What I do think, I look back on when I've had really difficult times around, as I say, redundancy or bereavement or loneliness or being overwhelmed, then when you see somebody else who's moved from another continent to take this workplace, or who's going through the loss of a parent or whatever, is putting yourself in somebody else's shoes and being, well, I could actually help. I could wait for HR to do it, but HR isn't your friend. Your people around you in the workplace are the company. And you can just make that first step. Even if people don't want the help, they probably appreciate the help being offered. So I think, well, yes, I think it is great that HR can do a policy, or the CEO can pass a rule, or we can do a better job of making sure line managers are more empathetic. I think a lot of the responsibility is on colleagues to look out for each other, to listen, to be empathetic, and to offer practical support, or bake some scones, or do something that shows that people are appreciated. I mean, there's loads of surveys that show that the things that make people stay in a company are not bonuses, but they are feeling appreciated and valued. And that does not necessarily come from your boss. It comes from everybody around, really getting around people when they need you so that they will do the same in return.
Absolutely. I think that's amazing advice. Definitely, like Claire mentioned as well, the camaraderie of being in the lab together and just being around people that you can talk to. It's definitely massive for people's mental well-being as well.
Yes, and I think men are not great at it. And I think sometimes people have to recognize that they need help, but find it really hard. I mean, I didn't grow up with the vocabulary to ask for help. There was and still is a stigma for men around asking for help as a sign of weakness. And while that's maybe better than it was 20 years ago, it hasn't gone. So sometimes you have to recognize that people need it, but don't know how to ask for it.
Absolutely. Checking in on one another is vital. Thank you, Peter. I'm going to move on to a slightly different topic now and head to Fiona, who, while she worked for GSK, was a really big advocate for coaching. So, Fee, how can coaching help, or what can coaching offer to manage your mental well-being through your professional development?
So, as somebody who has benefited from coaching through my career at GSK, multiple rounds of going through redundancies and various transitions, like going on maternity leave and then changing my career, but also somebody that provided coaching to others, I think it's hugely helpful in thinking about our well-being and our career. And really what it does is it gives us space. Sometimes we're working so hard that we don't have time to kind of stop and take stock and reflect on what we're doing and where we're going. So all those elements of career precarity, like fixed term contracts, feeling disempowered or feeling vulnerable, it's a space in which we can really reflect on what's challenging us, and come up with our own options and our own solutions to the issues that we're facing. So as a coach, you're not providing advice, you're just providing that environment, and that's really empowering for the coachee, to find your own solutions, to find your own way forward and not just be following the expected path. So yeah, it builds your confidence and kind of, you come up with your own solution. So I think it's really about, sorry, go on.
Go for it.
I think it's about being conscious about what we're doing, not just doing more of the same, not just trying to work harder, which is a trap I fell into when I first started work. Oh, I just need to do more and more. But actually pausing and coaching can be really good at giving you that regular space to pause and think. A couple of techniques that I guess I'd really recommend is things like monitoring your energy levels throughout the day. Are there activities that really you gain a lot of energy from, maybe like connecting to others or doing something that really boosts you, and other things that you dread and that you wish you didn't have to do, and kind of that can help you kind of get an idea of where it is you're wanting to go. And I'd also, I guess it leads to something Vicky said about counting those little wins. So keeping a log of all the things you have done, not the PhD or the big awards, but the little steps you've taken, maybe that person that you spoke to at that event or that training that you did, or And on those days when you're feeling like, oh, I don't know where I'm going, kind of reviewing that can really give you a boost and a point in the right direction.
I've also had that described as a sunshine folder, which I thought was a really lovely way
Lovely
of
name for it.
framing that. Thank you, Fee. I think a lot of people don't really understand what coaching is, or don't really know that it's available to them. So I think for many people in industry, coaching is probably a thing that your company will offer, but maybe for smaller companies or in academia, it's not something that's so readily available and there for you, which are what people will why people like Vicky exist to do that as well. So yeah, thank you for highlighting coaching as well. Okay, and finally, we're going to move on to, well, before we go into the Q&A box, we're going to chat to Faye. So some people might be looking for their first jobs post-university, or sometimes we find ourselves, like we talked about, being made redundant, coming to the end of a contract, or sometimes we choose to find a new role, and all of that transition can be difficult. So what advice do you have on managing your mental well-being in times of career precarity? And could you share some best practices while you're job searching?
Yeah, absolutely. So I think to start with the first sort of point, and managing your mental well-being in a career precarity or time of a career transition or change. I think, let's be honest, searching for a new job is mentally and emotionally draining. It doesn't matter whether you want to do it or whether you've been forced into that situation. So it's really easy to burn out. And those sort of feelings of self-doubt and loss of confidence creep in very, very quickly, because your guard is down, because you're putting yourself out there and often not getting much back. And I think when you're in a job search, or you're in a situation where you're in a precarious career time of your life, like anything else, you have to set boundaries. And I think making sure you still have a balance, and this is drawing on what Vicky said and what Fiona said, making sure you balance any sort of job search, any sort of career focus with self-care, with compassion. And I love Vicky's distinction between compassion and indulgence, because it is, people punish themselves. Oh no, I shouldn't go on that walk today, or I shouldn't see my friend today because I should be focusing on my job search. And actually that's not being compassionate to yourself. So making sure you are getting enough sleep, you are exercising if that's part of your normal self-care routine, getting fresh air, seeing friends, seeing family, eating things you like, not just eating healthily, but actually having that self-care and balancing it with the focus on the must-dos, have to do this is really important. Again, going back to something that the other panelists have said, talking to your peers and asking for help, or actually part of asking for help can just be venting, because that is just asking for somebody to listen. But yeah, your peers, your friends, recruiters, yes, we are here to do a job, but we're also here to offer advice, and hopefully that's fairly good advice a lot of the time. I think one of the key benefits of doing that and talking to peers and interacting with other people about your situation is everyone has a different perspective, and being able to reframe your thinking is actually really healthy a lot of the time, because you can get really stuck in a rut about what I'm doing, am I doing the right thing? You get stuck in a rut, but then you also question it and you're not able to really get out of that. So having someone to just kind of leverage you out of that rut can be very helpful. I talk to my team a lot about their sphere of control, and I think this is something that's really important when you're in a job hunt, or you're in a situation where, like I said, you're being made redundant, you're trying to transition. You have a sphere of control and you have a sphere of influence, and your sphere of control is what you can do, what you have control over. And that's things like your time, your CV, how many jobs you apply for, how high quality that application is. Your sphere of influence is things you can affect, but you don't have control over. So you might be able to affect the outcome of a job application process with your interview performance, but you have no control over the outcome of that. So going into that process thinking that, you know, oh, yeah, this is it, this is I'm going to do this and I've done really well and that's going to mean that I get that job is an unrealistic expectation to put on yourself. And I think having that, again, distinguishing between what's in my control and what's in my sphere of influence, and then what is outside that completely, is a really good way to separate out and to be able to focus on, I should be able to focus on what I can control only, and then look further out, you know, within that process. And someone said this to me recently, I know it's bandied around a lot, but comparison is the thief of joy. Comparing your process to other people's processes is not going to do you any favors as well. So, you know, if you're in a situation where you and along with other people are getting made redundant and you know half of those people have already found other jobs, comparing yourself in that situation is not going to do you any favors, because everybody's experience is different. Both their present experience and the experience they're relying on to get themselves new jobs. Something Fiona just said actually was you talked about, well, you just mentioned it, a sunshine list. So the list of, you know, mini wins, mini achievements. Something I also found really useful actually in lockdown when, let's face it, you know, things were not going great and I didn't feel particularly productive in my job. I wasn't searching for a job at the time, but as in even my job itself wasn't feeling particularly productive and it wasn't feeling effective. I wrote down a list of non-job related things, a to-do list. I think things I wanted to do. I wanted to plant some vegetables. I wanted to try and manage a 5K run. I wanted to actually clean the worktops in my kitchen properly as opposed to just doing a quick whiz round. I set 10 things and I got through that list and it made me feel productive, as opposed to feeling like I wasn't achieving anything in any area of my life. And I think when you're in that situation, you're searching for a job, that can feel like the one thing. And if it's consistently not getting anywhere, that's when failure is going to creep in. That's when self-doubt, that's when loss of confidence is going to creep in. So you have to balance that with productivity in other areas. And productivity doesn't mean having to produce something. It can mean just cleaning right to the back of your worktop instead of just the front bit. So that's quite a long answer to your first question. In terms of best practice job searching, I've said this once, I'll say it again, and I'll say it for years to come. You've got to treat job searching like a job. You've got to establish a routine. You've got to have a workflow. 9:30 till 10:30, I'm going to sit and search for jobs. I'm going to save the ones I want to apply to. I'm going to then take a break. 11 till 12, I'm going to sit and look at the jobs I want to apply to. Is my CV in the right area for that? You've got to set those tasks in that way and be structured about it, because otherwise it becomes a free-for-all. You don't have a strategy in your job search, you might as well be throwing spaghetti at the wall and seeing what sticks. I think you've got to set small tasks, set small goals, and celebrate when you win them. That goal shouldn't be, I'm going to get a job by the end of this week, or I'm going to get an interview by the end of this week. Those goals should be within your sphere of control. I'm going to send my CV out, or I'm going to apply to 5 jobs this week. It can be as small as, I'm just going to change the skills section on my CV this week. And those help you feel productive as well. You've got to manage your expectations. You know, it's a really good practice when you're searching for jobs. You know, I already said before, you're not alone. There's always hundreds, thousands of people looking for jobs. The flip side of that is there's always competition as well. So thinking you're going to get every job you apply for, you're even going to get a response to every job you apply for, is not realistic, because there are multiple people in the same boat. In terms of you know, little tidbits, I would say set yourself some criteria around what you want from your next opportunity, but keep an open mind. The job you think you're meant to do isn't necessarily the one you're going to build a career in. And that means whether you're early career or mid-career, actually the next role, the next choice for you could be something completely different, which, you know, 2 people on our panel have already demonstrated, and gone into a, you know, completely different field. I would say quality over quantity. Focus on high quality applications rather than loads and loads of applications. And crucially, don't be disheartened by lack of feedback or rejection. Not to put too fine a point on it, but hiring managers and recruiters, hundreds of applications. And, you know, although we don't like to think of ourselves as one of many, that's often the reality. And I would say 99.99% of the time, it has nothing to do with you personally. It's horrible, it's difficult to shake off. Take the time to be upset, to feel your emotions, to feel what you're feeling, ask for feedback, but set yourself a limit after which you're going to move on, because you can't move forward otherwise. Yeah, the job market's tough. That's the reality of it. Whether you're already in it or whether you're trying to get into it, and repeating that to yourself, even though it feels like a, you know, one of those "it is what it is" phrases, it is something you know, it's important to keep reiterating and to realize over and over again.
Thanks, Faye. I think it gives you permission as well when you think about it that way to sort of feel the way that you feel, and that that's okay. And then we make a plan and we move on.
Yeah, we've talked about toxic positivity before, that there's no point trying to put a positive spin on everything. You're allowed to feel dejected and to feel like you're, you know, to have those doubts, but to also set a boundary of going, I'm no longer going to let that affect me. And to like Fiona said, to use that as information as to, right, what can I do next? What do I need from this?
Yeah, absolutely. Okay, thank you very much. I'm now going to open up to the whole panel. We have had some questions in the Q&A chat box, and thank you to everyone who has sent questions. If we don't get through them all, they will all be answered, and their answers will be circulated. But the first question that we've had through is about essentially maintaining your well-being, your mental well-being in academia, and how do we make sure people feel that they can stay in academia even when they've had a bit of a negative experience, and improving things for the next generation of students to come. So I know Claire has written a little bit about here, and Vicky, but if you would like to summarise, or anyone else would like to share anything
Sure.
as well.
If I make a quick point, and then, because I think Vicky's answer was brilliant, I think you know, there's you have a choice, and it may be that the academic environment you're in at that point isn't the right one for you. And there's been lots of different, you know, that's come out in pretty much all of the experiences that have been shared. You know, actually, I love the idea of having a time. You know, the question that's currently being, or that's just been answered about, you know, you ask for help, you haven't got that support, actually putting in place, okay, where do you go next? And then giving yourself almost, you know, a time bound, a deadline, to think, okay, well, what do I do now? And taking the control and the ownership back on yourself. We are all part of the culture, whether it's the organisation, the research culture that we're in, and it's our own collective responsibility to call out and to point out to the people around us and the leaders in our organisations if things aren't working, and, you know, and to work together to come up with those solutions. But sometimes the environment you're in just isn't right for you, and it may be that, you know, that particular institution or that particular department or faculty isn't quite right, and, you know, moving on for the good of yourself, you may find an environment that's much more suitable for you and your experiences and your development. But Vicky, you picked up specifically on some of the very practical things that I think academia is starting to learn from beyond academia, the things that actually the likes of GSK and big pharma companies and big companies have been doing for a long time.
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the things we can all do, whether we're in academia or in industry, is learn to manage our own thoughts and emotions within a particular setting. And now, just to be clear, this is not toxic positivity. This is not resilience that means that you just put up with loads of stuff about you. But often what happens is we make things mean things about ourselves. And if we can stop doing that, if we can make it so if your supervisor or your boss is asking you for things that are unreasonable, that actually we're able to either request changes or to remove ourselves from that environment or to manage our own boundaries around that, then what we can do is sort of protect our own well-being. And by learning to do that, it also makes us better as we go through. Because one of the things I think we see in all settings is that the majority of toxic workplaces are created by people who are stressed. There's a few, in every industry, there's a few people that are just horrid people, and we probably know some of them. But the majority of the time, the pressures are created by supervisors who feel hugely under pressure, or bosses that feel hugely under pressure and who aren't managing their own emotions. And so they then push that pressure onto the people around them. And if the more we can learn at early stages of our career to manage these things, to allow ourselves space to feel them, like Faye said, but to also choose how we respond and choose what we focus on, then as we progress through, we can create more nurturing, more compassionate, more calm workplaces for the people that we work with. So it sometimes feels selfish to say, I need to work on me and how I manage all of these things. But actually, it can have huge institutional benefits to be able to do that.
Yeah, I would just add is, the upside of having a terrible boss is it can make you into a better boss yourself. Because actually, I have learned a lot more about being a boss from the things that drove me mad. I felt wildly unfair in how people behaves. And Vicky's right. There's reasons why people behave badly, but actually, firstly, you don't have to tolerate it. And I've definitely left workplaces based on this person isn't going to change. It's not making me happy. And then, you have to remember you can get another job. It's just a job. And this is not the only place you can be. And I think having the confidence in yourself to say, this is a bad situation. It's not me that's making it a bad situation. I can leave and do things better somewhere else is wildly empowering. But also, I think remember those things and how frustrating you found them when you were a line manager, and at least make different mistakes than they did.
Absolutely. Okay, moving on to a slightly different question. It's about access to therapy for postdoctoral and early career researchers. I would say many big pharma companies have things like employee assistance programs and things like that. But like I say, that's not available to everybody across all of the sectors. Maybe Fee, I can put this question to you: is what can people do, or what avenues can people take to access some therapy?
Yeah, so if you're not in an organisation that has an employee assistance programme, I guess you have a couple of options, at least. So one is going through NHS talking therapies. So you can go onto there and access CBT or more person-centred counselling. There can be long waiting lists, so I guess it's how long you're willing to to wait for that sort of thing, but that's available for free. Your local Mind Centre can often offer low-cost counselling. Other charities, and obviously if you have the finances to be able to access private counselling, then in the resource list I've got BBACP, so it's important to go to a counsellor that's a member of an ethical body. So there's a lot of counselling that's not regulated, so it's to make sure you go to something like the BACP or the UKCP to get somebody that's properly qualified. In terms of things you can do to help yourself if therapy's not an option right now, there are simple things for anxiety, things like looking at your self-care. I know we've talked about that already, and also in the resources there's an assessment tool in there for you to think about that holistically. So it's more than the kind of the basics of things like exercise and eating, but things about, like, as we've talked about, boundaries and thinking about your strengths and spiritual dimensions, and also things like breathing techniques, mindfulness, making time for those sorts of techniques. Practicing those can really help with kind of reducing those anxiety levels, over time, and managing that. Well, that's answered your question.
Yeah, thanks, Fee. So I'm gonna, unless anyone has anything to add on the panel at the moment, I'm just gonna flash up. Oh, go on, Faye.
Sorry, yeah, I was just going to say, I mean, it's been a long time since I was at university, and I don't know what the situation is now, but if you are a researcher at the university or at a university, there should be access to occupational health services who can signpost and refer you for counselling. And actually, when I was at university, I wasn't a researcher, so I wasn't working for the university, I was a student, but I managed to access it via that route. And that's a route that I think a lot of people don't know about necessarily, that occupational health is still at universities. It's not just something that's exclusive to private or public companies. So that's something I would look into as well.
That's a really good reminder. Thank you, Faye. So we keep talking about those, that list of resources. Here they are links within this slide. This will be sent out to everyone who's attended the call and registered for the event today. There's a whole host of different things on here. Some things that are more interactive, some of it just reading, some of it is links to more support networks. So like the Hub of Hope, for example, helps you find local support in your area and things like that. But thank you everyone today for joining the session, for engaging, for asking the questions. Any questions that are in the Q&A box that are unanswered will be answered, and again that will be shared with everybody, along with the recording of this session today will be available. We hope that you've enjoyed the session today, and for any of you interested in any of our future events, a little ELRIG plug here. Here's a calendar event of our free to attend events that are coming up later this year, and I'd just definitely like to highlight for the ECPs on the call another networking event that's happening in September, which is around your innovation skills to boost your career. So thank you again for your time and engaging in the session. Thank you so much to our panel, and I will end the call there. Thank you very much.